Okay, I think we are good to get started. So welcome everybody to MBH's presentation of the July 1st, 2023 NVAR Forms Changes. We're doing it webinar style. So if you have questions, you're going to put those in the chat box and we'll be able to get back to you after the webinar with the answers to any questions that you might have. That's just to make sure that we actually get through the end because we have quite a few participants. So we want to make sure we get through all of the content and we will follow up with all of those questions. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Christina J. Uribe. I'm a managing attorney for MBH Settlement Group, and I work out of a number of different offices. There's a joke that I should have a longer business card. I am from Royal, Warrenton, Winchester, and also Tyson's. So I cover areas, McLean, Vienna, Great Falls, and all surroundings. So you've probably seen me somewhere. If you haven't, I hope that you do. And I'm going to be presenting these form changes to you today. Beverly with MBH will be putting my contact information into the chat box as well. So if you have any follow-up questions or want to reach out to me directly, feel free to. She's also going to be posting links to the actual forms updates themselves, along with our summary of the forms changes. After the webinar, we'll send out via email a copy of the PowerPoint. So if you're hoping to receive that, you will. The PowerPoint's very similar to the summary, but maybe a little bit more pared down, so a little bit easier to read. So look out for that so that you have it for reference as you're moving forward through these changes starting July 1st, which is just around the corner. Hopefully we have a nice busy end of month before we get there. And then we can kind of settle into what these new changes are. But we like to be ahead of the game, so we want to make sure that you're on board. So I'll also say before I start, I just wanted to highlight, I don't have a nice slide for it on here, which maybe I should have added, our MBH Ultimate Homebuyer Guide. We're going to be highlighting it this month, as always. For those of you who have worked with MBH, you know that our Homebuyer Guide has been an excellent resource that we've provided to our agents, to their customers for many, many, many years. It's evolved over time into our Ultimate Homebuyer Guide. We now have it available in 4 versions. So Nova, Northern Virginia, DC Metro, Maryland, and also Coastal Virginia. And then any one of those homebuyer guides you can get in English or Spanish. I actually have a Spanish guide with me today. I don't know if you can see it with my background. Nope, you probably can't. And I can do closings in Spanish. So if you need that service, anybody who's on the call, also make note of my contact information because that's a service that MBH can provide. So those homebuyer guides are an awesome resource. If you haven't seen them, make sure that you grab one. They're also available online. They're a tool for your client, but also a tool for you. They're a really great learning mechanism for newer agents, and a great way just to set expectations for your clients prior to the entire process kind of taking off, and to avoid unrealistic expectations. So use them. The contract is fully explained. We always keep it updated. And remember that you can get physical copies from any one of our offices, or you can grab the PDF on our website, mbh.com. So residential sales contract is where we're going to start when we talk through our changes today. I probably should have ended with this because I think it's probably most of the time our most important and exciting section. I will say we're not looking at huge drastic changes to the contract itself, to our addenda, or the way that you guys are going to do business coming this July 1st. So take a deep breath. It's nothing major, but some things that are really important to be aware of in working through your contracts with buyers and sellers. So sales contract changes, these are going to apply to both the residential and the land contract. The first one being that we've now highlighted the buyer's notice to seller regarding buyer's choice of settlement agent. So in other words, highlighting quite literally. So right before that section where the buyer chooses who the settlement agent is going to be, it says in bold, buyer's notice to seller. And that's just to make it stand out a little bit more and to make it clear to all parties. As you know, after the Bureau of Insurance letter that was received some time ago, There's been some emphasis on understanding the relationship of the settlement agent, how it affects split closings, and otherwise just the duties of the settlement agent as chosen under the contract. So we're going to see those duties and responsibilities being highlighted and an effort towards more clarity. So buyer's notice to seller. I should have put in here, but I'll just say it. That's probably where you want to put MBH Settlement Group. We want to do your closings, guys. So please, please, please send us your contracts. We love working with you, as always. And we're going to be here for you, as you've come to expect through navigating all of these changes. Second changes, ensures consistency with Virginia code, including references to RESA, the Residential Property Disclosure Act, and the Resale Disclosure Act. So as of July 1st, we have a new Virginia code section. You'll see this in my next set of bullets, 23.1, chapter 23.1. That's the Resale Disclosure Act. And what we're doing in layman's terms is we're taking condo rules and homeowners association rules, and we're in a sense lumping them together into one act. Okay, so you're not any longer going to see references throughout the contract to separate rules for HOA as there are for condo. For many, many years, we've seen those separate paragraphs in our contract, and we should be really happy if we're doing anything to the contract that makes it shorter. So we're combining those paragraphs so that we have a little bit more concise section to reference. And it's nice because at the end of the day, they said the exact same thing, right? It was copy and paste from the acts themselves, almost entirely identical, if not entirely identical. And now we've got one paragraph for HOA and or condo. So don't panic. It's not that scary. But that Virginia Resale Disclosure Act is what's requiring that we have that one notice to purchasers as to their rights and responsibilities under the act, as opposed to two separate ones. So what do you do in situations, I guess, practically when you have properties that are in either more than one HOA or they're in both an HOA and a condo, is the most practical question that I've been getting concerning the lumping together of these two sections. And the answer is you have more than one. The right to void the contract that follows delivery of the resale certificate is going to run from the date of delivery of the last. So if you have multiple, and that's whether you have two HOAs, let's say you're in Reston, or you have an HOA and a condo, now that you don't have two separate paragraphs, you're going to have one paragraph specifying the preferred delivery method, or where to, if electronic, where to, if physical copies. And then in that paragraph, it will encompass any HOA or condo that the property may be subject to. So more concise, more clear. I think this is a good change. You just have to understand the way that it works in situations where you have multiple. There's been some social media buzz as to certain omissions in this act. I know I've talked to a number of agents at sales meetings about the potential repercussions of a couple of omissions, or rather one that's probably more important. When the act was written into code, or chapter 23.1, and I want to talk about that briefly, but not get stuck on it for too long, because I think a lot of the social media buzz is potentially making it into a bigger issue than it ought to be. There's let's say, a prohibition on waiving the review of documents. So as we've come to be familiar with HOA and condo contingency in the contract, there was a prohibition on waiving the review of documents. So this was something that the buyers got the right to receive those documents. They received the right to receive the documents, and that 3 to 7 day, now we have a potential 7-day right to void. And it was just a part of the contract, a part of the act. And there was a mention that it couldn't be varied by agreement. So one of the things that people are talking about with the new act is that it's possible that the Virginia legislature inadvertently left out the language that says the terms of this act cannot be varied by agreement. So The fear being, right, that you're on the other side of a contract and someone reaches out to you in a market where we're super competitive. We have tons of people competing over limited inventory, and they want to waive, or the seller wants to request the buyer to waive their right to receive the agreements under the documents under the act for review, or waive their 3-day right to void, or vary that 3 to 7 day right to void even more than they already are allowed to under the words of the act. The reason I don't want to stick on this too long or belabor it is because I think we could make it into a bigger issue than it is. I think based on my reading of the code sections, the reading in the contract as everything has been updated to comply with it, the understanding is going to be we proceed as normal. Okay, so you shouldn't be initiating this from one side or another. If you run into it on the other side, someone saying, no, now we're able to vary it by agreement, so this is what we want to do, reach out to one of your MBH attorneys or managers to discuss it, to discuss what you should do in that situation. And if there's a way to include language that clarifies anything that anybody is trying to accomplish through varying this act by agreement. As I said, my opinion, and every attorney is going to have a different opinion, but my opinion is the act wasn't written to be varied. The act doesn't include a right to vary the 3-day right to void up to 7 days because they intended in any way for you to then vary it again up to 10, up to 20, or to remove it entirely. So I think that the intent of the legislature is the same, and I think we should all move in that direction. But again, if you have any questions about the fact that they omitted that language, the cannot be varied by agreement language, reach out to one of us. Of course, MBH is going to stay on top of this, and if we become aware of any updates or clarification that's offered, we're going to be getting that out to you guys formally as soon as possible. But prefer not to, again, make formal statements about Virginia legislature's intent or lack thereof in omitting that language. And we're going to keep our eye out for some real clarification so that we're giving you accurate information. Okay, so that's the Virginia Resale Disclosure Act. The solar panels and electric vehicle charging stations. So we have some in our sales contracts. We have new introductions into the conveyances paragraph. The solar panels and electric vehicle charging stations were added to the conveyances. They do convey. Okay, so we want to think of these as fixtures. In essence, they are, right? They're bolted into the property. So solar panels and those electric charging stations become a part of the property when they are added. And unless the contract is modified as to conveyances to say that they don't convey, then they are going to convey per the contract, the way that it's written with the new updates. Someone asked me the other day, are we ever going to get to a point where we're getting, one update every year as opposed to one every 6 months from NVAR? And I think the answer is, so long as we as people are becoming smarter and more advanced, we're always going to have something to add to this section, right? It started with, I remember when we had to clarify whether wall-mounted TVs were going to convey, the electronic devices themselves versus the mounts. Then we started talking about smart devices that are installed as a part of the home. And now we're on to solar panels and electric vehicle charging stations. So don't be frustrated by the updates. Know that NVAR is doing everything they can to be partners to us, to stay on top of things as they're changing, and to keep and create a contract that is not biased in one way or the other, but that provides clarity to customers. And more clarity means less liability for you. So those inclusions are good things so that you don't end up at the settlement table with people confused as to what in the world was supposed to convey and what wasn't. And so a large part of these updates is just keeping up with the times and the changes and how things are working in our market. So after that, you've got one last bullet point on here. The options to select the new solar panel addendum and other were added to the additions paragraph. So your additions paragraph is at the very end of your contract. And the new solar panel addendum is referenced there if it's going to be attached. We're going to talk about that addendum because the new solar panel addendum does add a contingency potentially when it's used for houses that are conveying with solar panels. And other was added so that there's a space to add any additional attachments or addendums. So that is our residential sales contract and our land contract, you guys. A lot of these changes, as we talk through them, if they have to do with addenda, you know that affects the contract as well. And so we're kind of tying it all together. We have some changes to the seller's estimated cost of settlement charges. Oop, I have a typo. So charges, net sheet. So the net sheet has references on it, obviously, when you guys are trying to calculate the seller's estimate of closing costs that need to be updated as well. So some small updates to this form. The recording releases section was updated to $51 to include e-file fees. So generally, in most of the jurisdictions that we do business with an e-file of recorded documents applies, we have a $4.25 fee that gets added to any document that's recorded in that jurisdiction. So $4.25 on a standard buyer settlement statement, for example, with a deed and a mortgage, you're going to see $8 added or $8.50 added, excuse me. So you'll see those fees appearing on there. That's why this has been updated. So for recording of releases, we're changing it to 51 to include the e-file. Not a major one. I would hope if you were off by a couple of bucks, your sellers wouldn't be too mad at you, but keeping it as current and as practical as possible. Regional congestion relief fee and the WMATA capital fee were updated to a total of $2 per thousand. It's been this way for a while, you guys. So the amount of the calculation as it applies to your closings themselves is not changing, but the net sheet needed to be updated. So the net sheet will now properly calculate your taxes on the seller side when you're looking at a jurisdiction where the WMATA capital fee or the congestion relief fee do apply. So remember, I put a little note on here. Total on the seller side that we will see is $3 per thousand to include the grantor's tax. So that's a good thing just to remember in your mind, depending on where you're doing your closings. And I can tell you, because I've seen on split closings, settlement statements prepared by a number of different companies, sometimes the breakdown shows up a little bit different. A lot of companies will split that grantor's tax into two so that you can see which half is going to the county and which half is going to the state. Some of them will lump it together. And I've seen lender CDs where everything is lumped into one. Okay, so you've got one big number representing taxes on the seller side. And it's okay, no matter how it shows up, just make sure that that total is looking like $3 per thousand to you. And then remember that those calculations are always going to be based on the higher of the sales price or the assessed value. So if you're working in a situation where the assessed value is much higher than the sales price, you want to account for that when doing your seller net sheets. And that notation is on the net sheet itself. So if you're reading through the NVAR summary of the forms changes or our summary, it doesn't spell that out specifically. So just remember it and take the PowerPoint as a reference if you need it. The two mentioned above only apply in certain jurisdictions, just a little notation as well. So remember, this is not something new, but the congestion relief fee and the WMATA capital fee are only going to apply in certain jurisdictions. Generally speaking, we're talking about Prince William County and further north or further east. So when you get out to Fauquier County, to Warren County, and a lot of the westernmost counties, you don't pay those additional fees. And it's only the $1,000 per thousand, or excuse me, $1 per thousand in grantor's tax that you're going to see on that seller net sheet being collected. So those updates are good ones, just to make sure that your estimates to your clients are as accurate as they can possibly be. Remember that we have a tool on our website as well that you can use for generating net sheets and quotes to clients, whether it's on the seller side or the buy side. So if you go to mbh.com and you kind of hover over the bottom right-hand corner, you're going to see a little calculator looking widget that you can click on to generate quotes. And that's a really helpful tool in making sure that no matter what has gone on and no matter what has been updated, ours will always be up to date, and you can use that to generate some good information. All financing contingency addenda. So I lumped all of this into one. If you look at the summary, it's going to separate them out, but the change was the same and it was super minor. So removal of a little bit of redundant language from the appraisal contingency paragraphs, so that we're not repeating ourselves. And again, we should be thrilled and very happy when redundant language is removed and our contracts are getting shorter and our addenda are getting shorter as opposed to longer, which we know is generally the trend in this business, I should say, in general. The contingencies and clauses addendum. The contingencies and clauses addendum, the blanks for initials were removed from this form. Now, don't be confused in thinking that the initial boxes that are to the left-hand side of each contingency or clause has been removed. Those initial blocks are still there. But if you've noticed, hopefully you've noticed, but our contract no longer has initial boxes in the bottom corner of every single page. And that's the trend. So we're moving towards removing those blanks from other forms as well. This one was updated because they had lingered through. So bottom page initials have been removed, but you still have the ones in the blocks next to each contingency or clause. So remember, you guys, just when filling that one out, I've received a number of contracts over the years where even if you're only intending to activate, let's say, one of the contingencies or clauses in the form, all of those boxes to the left are initialed. Don't do that. All right. Make sure that you're not over initialing. You don't want to cause it to come into question as to whether you're creating another contingency or clause that you didn't mean to create. The form is meant for you to initial next to the one that is going to apply to the left-hand side. All right, so we have a couple of lease changes as well. The VRLTA lease changes are all about pets. So those of you who know me know I have a number of pets. I have 6 dogs currently, which is actually down from my total, my high at one point in time. And I just bought a pony. I don't know why, but I bought a pony. So now I've got a pony and 6 dogs. And so pets are something that is often relevant for me in my personal life, but of course it's relevant when we talk about leases as well. And it tends to be really relevant and continuously so because we have so many people opting or, using pets as service animals. So these changes don't necessarily have to do with service animals, but I have a little reminder in here for you for fair housing, just so that you don't forget to keep that in the back of your mind. So the VRLTA lease changes, paragraph 4 for rent in this form was updated to add rows for the non-refundable pet fee in accordance with the pet addendum and an option for other applicable fees. So the addendum, which you're going to see after this listed below, this pet addendum now has a section for a non-refundable pet fee. This is separate and apart from a pet security deposit. And so it's important to note that it's in there. And the definition of rent under the VRLTA lease itself has been updated to include it. The definition, that's my next bullet. The definition of rent was updated to clarify that pet rent is included as well in place of pet fees. And reminder concerning fair housing. So as I mentioned with fair housing, just always remember that if somebody is using an animal as a service animal, you're not going to be charging any additional pet rent, any additional pet fee, or an additional pet security deposit. So fair housing protects people with disabilities, and the way that fair housing works, they're able to request reasonable accommodations for disabilities. One of those reasonable accommodations is to have a service animal. So the act is very clear, the Fair Housing Act, and saying that we're not to charge additional rent, security deposits, or fees as a result of somebody using a service animal when it has to do with the disability. This is not in the updates, you guys. I just added that bullet point because I wanted to add a little reminder concerning that since we're talking about pets and fees. The pet addendum itself. So this form was updated to add an option for a non-refundable pet fee. As I mentioned before, that pet fee is to be paid when the addendum is signed, and that language is on the addendum itself, so it's very clear as to what is expected. And that would be a flat fee, right? So additional non-refundable pet fee. So for people who want to charge that in advance, because they don't want to wait until the time that the tenant moves out to determine whether or not there's damage, they want to charge a fee to kind of, accommodate for the fact that there may be and prepare for it in advance. Initial lines were removed. The initial lines were removed and additional blanks were added for the parties' signature lines. So that one's pretty simple. Let's just have a little bit of extra room to sign. And like I said, a lot of these updates tend to be just clerical in nature, but they're good things to make the forms a little bit more practical for you to work through. Next, we have changes to the appraisal contingency without financing contingency. So as you guys know, our financing contingency forms, if you're using one of those forms, they include the appraisal contingency within. Okay, so you don't need to find yourself in a situation where you're using the appraisal contingency separate form without financing contingency if you are contingent on financing. But this form exists for situations where the contract is not contingent on financing, but the buyer does want it to be contingent upon appraisal. So this form, I put a little reminder here at the top, again, not to do with changes, but relatively recent changes. So I just remind you of it, that now we have the traditional appraisal contingencies, but we also have appraisal contingencies with the gap guarantee. I am sure in this market, as wild as it has been, that you guys have seen or come across somebody using the appraisal contingency with gap guarantee. So the gap guarantee is essentially the buyer's offer to proceed with closing if the appraisal plus a certain amount of money that we're referring to as the gap is equal to or greater than the sales price. Negotiation can still take place if not, but proposed sales price will not be less than the appraisal plus the gap. So just a reminder, that's something that is still relatively new as we're working through our contracts. And I'm sure in the current environment and as competitive as things have become, we're seeing it more often than not. So remember that negotiation can still take place, but the sales price cannot be less than the appraisal plus the gap because the buyer has pre-agreed in advance, right, to cover a certain amount in between when that appraisal comes in low. So this form that we're talking about now was updated to remove redundant language, same as all of the other appraisal contingencies, so nothing major, a little bit of clarification and a little bit less redundancy, which is always nice. And an appraisal deadline was added to the appraisal contingency plus gap guarantee. So we didn't see consistency prior to this or prior to July 1st. If you look at your old forms, between the first traditional appraisal contingency that had an appraisal deadline and the new one and the second one, that did not have the appraisal deadline worked into that language when we're talking about the gap guarantee. So to make them match, to make business easier so that you don't have to guess which rules you're following based on which contingency was selected, the appraisal deadline has now been added. So that's a good change as well. We have a couple of optional forms. So the optional forms, the info for making, info is my shorthand, information for making an offer form, and the buyer cover sheet form are both optional forms that NVAR offers to you to assist in preparing offers and counter offers on your contracts. So most importantly here, you guys, remember that they're optional. Again, this is just a little side note, but I think important to note. And at the top of each of those forms, you're going to see language that makes it very clear, right? A little CYA that says this document is being provided to offer support in preparing offers or in presenting offers, but doesn't become a part of the contract itself. And it's not going to, like the info for making an offer form is not going to create liability on behalf of a seller. So at the end of the day, what you guys need to remember and keep on working through the same rule is ensure that your contracts include all of the terms that you need your contracts to include. So many times, you know, the question comes to me or the comment comes to me, well, it was in the listing, right? It was in the listing, so my buyers should have gotten it. Well, or now we're seeing, well, it was in the info for making an offer form, right? So they should have received it. If you don't reiterate those same terms when you're preparing your offer and incorporate them into a ratified contract, you're not going to be guaranteed anything that was included in the cover sheet. So it's for usefulness only in helping to prepare offers. And it is particularly helpful in situations where you have multiple offers to have that cover sheet with some additional information included. So I love the forms. Just remember to use them appropriately so that they don't create issues for anyone. To clarify now, those forms were clarified that lender letters are pre-qualification and pre-approval letters, which is nice. We don't want to, you know, keep using the language lender letters when we're talking about contingencies or anything like that. It's just too vague. We're not sure what exactly it includes. So pre-qualification and pre-approval letters is the reference that's included in those optional forms. The options to add internet and cable providers were added to the utilities section of the listing information sheet. So that info for making an offer form will now give options for including what those internet and cable providers are. I have the joy of working in a number of different markets. And so I've had firsthand experience in seeing let's see, more city folk, right? People from Washington, D.C. even, or Northern Virginia counties buying properties out in more rural Virginia. And so internet has been a huge thing in preparing those offers and in the buyer making sure that it is even something that would work from them. If the goal is to work from home, right? You need to make sure that you have internet at the home you're purchasing in rural Virginia. And so all of these changes, you guys, they just kind of flow with what is happening in the market, what the important things are nowadays to identify. And as we change and as we grow, these things are necessary and they're inserted to make it more convenient and more helpful for you. Okay. So back to the extension of the review period. We're going to talk a little bit more about the condo and HOA. So extension of review period for COA and POAA addendum. So this form was modified in accordance with the new Resale Disclosure Act. As you can imagine, the title, of course, was changed. So rather than it be called the prior title to incorporate both the condo and the POA Act, the name is now Extension of Review Period for Common Interest Community Resale Certificate Addendum. Now that is a tongue twister. Don't try to say it too many times fast. I had to make sure I was even typing it correctly. But that's the name of the form. So if you're looking for it, you need to identify it. That's where it is. And that's the form, you guys, that allows that 3-day right to void to be extended up to 7 days. So still, even after those changes, even after the COA and the POAA have been kind of lumped into this Resale Disclosure Act in 23.1, we still see that our NVAR addendum reflect the terms of the act. There's no exception. There's no additional modification that's worked into those forms. It says still the allowable modification is no more than 4 additional days. So I told you before, I'll stand by it. I believe if they wanted to allow additional modification beyond that, they would have allowed it in the words of the act. So I'm not taking the omission of the language that it cannot be modified to be an agreement by the Virginia legislature that their intent was to allow modification. These forms are pretty straightforward. So if we keep on doing business as usual, hopefully we won't get ourselves into too much trouble. So it clarifies this form also that there's only one right of cancellation under the Resale Disclosure Act, regardless of which common interest community the property is going to fall under, HOA or condo, or multiple of either. It runs from delivery of the last one delivered. Okay, so remember, now that we have them combined, you're not going to find yourself in a situation where you have an HOA and a condo and 2 separate rights to void that last for 3 days to 7 days each. So one right to void that's going to be triggered by delivery of the last resale certificate to be delivered. So that's all important. That's all to remember very clearly in moving forward. And probably the most substantive, I would say, change to the contract itself is this language change, and just in making sure that we're working in the right direction. Don't call your brokers and ask them why there's a missing paragraph, because we're all lumped into one now, and that was intentional. Okay, so understanding your rights under the VA COA and POAA Act form, another name change. So if you guys recall, this form is the kind of 2 to 3 page form that gives a restatement of all of those rights and responsibilities under the Resale Disclosure Act. We just have one, again, lumped together that describes both condo and HOA. And if you read through that act, it doesn't even differentiate between the two. So we're really considering all common interest communities to be one and the same, whether they're HOA, whether they're condo, when it comes to the rules that govern delivery of the documents, completeness of the documents, the right to order an updated document, the right to void, and all of those things that follow. So the new name to this form is Understanding Your Rights under the Resale Disclosure Act. That one's not as big of a tongue twister, so we'll take that change. The information regarding the contents of the resale certificate, the buyer's right of cancellation, were completely rewritten in accordance with the code. So rewritten in the sense that we're combining those two together now. So some rewrites had to take place. But not in the sense that we're drastically changing the way that things work. So we're hoping that things continue in that same direction. You should read through the forms because they're a good reminder of what's allowable under the condo and HOA acts prior to, and now the Resale Disclosure Act when it comes to delivery of that resale certificate. It can be convoluted, and you guys know that because I get more questions about this than maybe any other topic when it comes to a buyer being frustrated that they haven't received the documents yet. So read through them, understand that the rights and responsibilities are all laid out in there. And again, reach out if you have any questions specifically about how you're to move forward in the new act and with the new circumstances. Okay, we have a couple of new forms. So a new form and a new addendum, all related to the solar panels. And we talked about this a little bit before, so I'm going to talk through kind of what those addendums do. The first new form is the solar panel addendum to the listing agreement. I love that these exist now, you guys, because I would say not even a week ago, I had an agent reach out to me who wanted to create some sort of language for a contract for a property in Arlington that had solar panels. And they were concerned about the fact that the seller had prior financing or still in place financing for those solar panels. And you guys know, if you've worked with any properties that have them, or if you've looked into getting them yourself, that most of those companies do finance the solar panels over the course of a number of years. So you go under contract on a house, you still have outstanding financing, and it's something that does need to be discussed and does need to be accounted for. So these new forms are going to allow a vehicle for discussing it without having to practice law and creating contract language to create contingencies or otherwise contract around what needs to be done for solar panels. So solar panel addendum to the listing agreement, created to reflect a need in the region for proper conveyance of properties with solar panels. Sellers will now be obligated to provide any documentation they have regarding solar panels on the property to the listing agent at the time of execution of the listing agreement, including information about ownership status and financing. So you're not going to be in the dark, right? You're going to go through your listing agreement. Hopefully you'll be able to see if there are solar panels on the house to know when you go to your appointment whether or not to bring that addendum with you or have it available at least, so that you can talk through these rules and details and make sure that you receive everything you're supposed to receive upfront at the listing agreement execution itself. So the new addendum, and the purpose for that is to make sure that when you get to contract ratification, you have all of the information you need already in hand, right? You don't want to wait until it's too late and you guys are ratifying the contract to be going through the details of what kind of financing is in place. Do you have documentation related to it? So getting it up front is going to help. The new addendum, solar panel contingency addendum to sales contract. Like I said, it's been a number of times that I've seen this addendum or this contingency being created by agents themselves, right, via a separate addendum. And so to have something that can be used that will protect buyers is a really good thing. And again, setting expectations with clients is key. So talking about these things and not leaving them to the last minute is going to be completely necessary. You definitely don't want to be a day before closing when someone first thinks about the fact that there's $40,000 in financing outstanding on solar panels that now, per our contract, are supposed to convey. So the new addendum, use it, know it's there. Be informed. You guys are on the webinar, so you're already more informed than everybody else. So be the ones that bring it to the table correctly. So this is a new addendum for sales contracts, which creates the option of a new contingency for buyers. Upon ratification of the sales contract, the sellers are obligated to deliver documentation regarding any solar panels, including any financing or lease agreement documentation to buyers within a negotiable time frame. Now, when I'm putting this summary together for you on this PowerPoint, I'm kind of lumping those two sections together. When you actually look at the addendum itself, you're going to see that the delivery of documentation regarding the solar panels is listed separately from the information regarding financing. It's broken down on there a little bit more specifically because you're going to have to designate whether it's subject or whether it's owned outright, right? Whether they're owned outright, whether they're subject to financing, or whether they're subject to a lease. So as you look through that, I looked through it a number of times. I think it's pretty self-explanatory and you guys should have no problems navigating it. But all of that documentation is going to be provided to buyers within a negotiable time frame. As NVAR loves to do, which we love, they try to make a lot of their contingencies look the same and feel the same. So you're going to have a contingency period there stated at the beginning. The parties will then have the opportunity to negotiate whether the seller will pay off the remainder of the loan by settlement or if the buyer will assume the loan for the solar panels. Should the information found in either the loan documents or the solar panel documentation be unacceptable to buyer, then the buyer has the option to void the sales contract within that contingency period. So again, love this change, love these new additions, just to make sure that there's clarity surrounding this type of thing. And remember, every time NVAR creates something for us like this, it helps us in other circumstances as well. I've had a number of contracts, as I've said, I work in the country and I work in the city. So we've got city problems and we've got country problems. My country problems usually surround generators, installation of generators and similar financing. So NVAR hasn't added an addendum for a contingency for generator financing, but it's kind of the same. So if you're doing a contract and something comes up and there's been an installation that's a fixture to the property, and there's financing associated with it, there's going to be a need to account for what happens with that financing at the time of the closing. So know that they're giving us this material, and reach out to one of us, one of your MBH attorneys, if you run into a situation that's similar, but a little bit different, because we have a guide now to use, which is really, really, really helpful for anything that's similar to this kind of situation. Okay, so we're going to talk about listing agreements, buyer broker agreements next. So exclusive right to sell listing agreements, the listing agreement, the exclusive agency listing agreement, the exclusive right to lease, and the exclusive right to sell unimproved land agreements. All of these are lumped into one slide because the changes are uniform throughout. So the first thing is that we have a new option for brokers to terminate listing agreements in the event their sellers or landlords are not cooperating. The language not cooperating really means they're in breach. Okay, so if you have landlords or sellers that have duties under the listing agreement, there's now clear language and 2 new forms that allow the brokers themselves to terminate those agreements when applicable, which is a good thing. I put a little summary in here of where the board was going when they were thinking about this. The committee researched why listing agreements never had an option for brokers to terminate listing agreements, and discovered that there is a code section that allows for termination of brokerage relationships upon default expiration or mutual lease. But then according to another code section in Virginia, there are 2 types of relationships that are formed by brokerage representation agreements. You have agency relationships that are formed, and you have brokerage contractual relationships. Agency relationships, as you guys know, because you've been to, I'm sure, a number of different agency classes, can be created without agreement. So you can create an agency relationship by acting like you're in an agency relationship, for example. So those relationships are viewed as separate from the brokerage contractual relationship that you would also have to terminate in order to make sure that you've properly terminated the rights and responsibilities that exist between a landlord, a seller, and the broker. In order to terminate a brokerage representation agreement, therefore, both relationships have to be terminated to completely relieve both parties. The brokerage representation agreements were all updated to include the definition for the 2 types of relationships created. So now that's more clearly spelled out based on the committee's research, right? If you want to terminate, you have to terminate both. And the new forms are going to assist in making sure that that happens appropriately. So the seller or landlord's option to terminate the agreement early in paragraph 12F was updated to require, and this goes both ways. So now we're talking about, the tenant, or the the landlord or the seller terminating an agreement, from their direction, they would have to use these forms. And then the same forms would be used if the agreement was being terminated by the broker. So the written notice has to be delivered to the broker to terminate the agency relationship. The client then has the option to use the new form, notice to terminate brokerage relationship or representation agreement. And then after payment of the negotiable early termination fee, if that applies, the parties would then sign the new form, release of brokerage representation agreement, to terminate the relationship between the parties and relieve everybody of contractual obligations. Seller default and landlord default paragraphs were added. And that's to make it really clear what has to happen for a client or for a broker to breach their responsibilities and duties under the agreement. And the broker now has the option to terminate the brokerage release representation agreement early by delivering the new notice to terminate the agency relationship and then executing that same release by both parties to terminate it. So it was wishy-washy before, right? I would get calls from brokers, from agents discussing situations where they felt that they were in a position of needing to terminate a relationship with a client because the client is asking them to violate the law, violate fair housing, or do something unethical. So if you're in a situation where the client themselves are in default, it's now clear that that representation agreement can be terminated not only by them, but by the broker. So I think that's a good change. Additional changes to this form or these forms as a collective: the conveyances and provided fixtures paragraphs were updated to include those solar panels and electric vehicle charging stations. They do convey, just as another reminder, we talked about that already. Paragraph 12 for broker compensation, this is another one of the bigger changes, was modified to reflect 3 new types of compensation for brokers. So you have one, a percentage of gross sales price, right? This is what you typically see, our 6% listings, or, try not to reduce when you don't need to reduce, you guys, but I know it happens. So whatever that percentage may be is entered there, or a flat fee, or a combination of the two. So you can have a percentage plus a flat fee. I will direct you to your brokers on this. So please, discuss with your brokers. I'm sure that they're going to be having contracts classes to discuss the changes themselves and how they feel about the changes to the brokerage relationship agreements. And so talk with them about what's expected when it comes to fees and compensation so that everybody is working in the right direction within your brokerage as well. Beware of blanks and fill in the correct ones. So as always, you guys, contracts, the ones that we work on are form documents. So blanks are important. They all stand for something, and you're going to create an obligation or a duty or responsibility that's solid once you fill something in. So if you look at this form, when you take a look at the actual updated forms, you can see that it would be very easy to fill in the incorrect blank. So pay attention to which one you're filling in so that you don't land yourself in a really weird situation, finding it difficult to correct and difficult to collect your correct commission on the day of closing. The option for a broker service fee was added to the broker's compensation paragraph as well. And then the option for other compensation was removed, which I think is great. Other compensation was confusing. It was vague. It didn't spell out what the options were. And sometimes it would lead to really creative writing in that section. So I think keeping it simple and having the options, you check off one of the 3, is going to be the best way to go. Compensation for the broker in the event of a tenant purchase option was removed from the exclusive right to lease because it was deemed as double dipping. We saw this a lot. You have a listing agreement for a landlord or for a tenant, and they end up buying. You don't want to be double dipping on commission or for it to appear that that's what you're intending to do. So that language was removed because that's not the intent. An additions paragraph was added. to the seller listing agreements for addenda to be identified. For example, the new solar panel addendum. So if you have a new solar panel addendum that you're attaching to your listing agreement, you identify that in the additions paragraph so that it's all clear what's going to be made a part of it. And then you can collect all of that information in advance as you're supposed to be doing. Lastly, I think this is our last section of updates. So the exclusive right to represent tenant agreement and the exclusive right to represent buyer agreement. So now we're flipping to the other side. We're not talking about our landlords and sellers. We're talking about our buyers and our tenants. The early termination provisions of the listing agreements are mirrored exactly into these two forms. So those early termination rights that are going to exist for brokers upon breach of a buyer or a tenant of those agreements will be mirrored here and will be available just the same. Paragraph 2 was updated to clarify the purpose of the agreements and that the property sought is real property in Virginia. This paragraph in the exclusive right to represent buyer was also modified to add that if the settlement date for a property occurs after expiration of the agreement, but the contract was ratified during the term of that agreement, then the agreement will be automatically extended until settlement. This is great for you. It makes sure that you're covered in situations where your agreement has expired, but you haven't quite gone to closing yet. So a good clarification to be added for you guys. The compensation paragraph was updated to reflect two new compensation types. So again, this is the percentage of gross price and a flat fee. An option for a broker's service fee was added to the compensation paragraph as well, similar to your other agreements. And again, be careful with your blanks. So make sure you're filling in the correct blank so that you don't run into an issue. I remember when the seller subsidy moved to the first paragraph of the contract. I don't know if you guys remembered that. When that seller subsidy blank was added, I had probably 2 or 3 contracts come over to me where the full financing amount was written into the seller subsidy blank. Obviously not the intent for the seller to give a subsidy of the entire amount financed. And that was just simply changes were made to the contract. You're working too quickly, so you're plugging it into the wrong blank, and that can happen here too. So be careful with your blanks. Anytime changes are made, just be careful because you're looking at a newly formatted document. The paragraphs are going to appear on different pages, albeit in the same order because of that condo HOA section shrinking. So you want to make sure you're working in the right places. Lastly, the compensation paragraph was updated to ensure that contracts for any property type would inure compensation for the broker. So another clarification that's a good one to make sure that you guys are paid for the work that you're doing, and get these agreements signed, certainly in advance. I don't want to see anybody at my settlement table having their buyer broker agreement signed during the closing. I've seen that too. So make sure you guys that you're staying on top of it, that you're getting these things signed. I know your brokers stay on top of you as well, to make sure that they're done properly. But all of these changes, I think, are good ones for clarification to keep us moving in the right direction. Again, don't be panicked about the changes to HOA and condo. The merging of those two sections into the Resale Disclosure Act in the new section 23, chapter 23.1 is fine. Right? You just need to understand how it works when you have multiple, which you're not going to run into too often, but when you do, that's going to be relevant. And it keeps things a little bit more simple and a little bit less redundant, which we're seeing as a theme with a lot of the changes that have been made. Last thing I've got for you, last tidbit here as we end, as always, this is something I tell to my agents all the time. Do not treat this one like the last one or the next one like this one. So set expectations, stay educated. You're doing that already by being on the webinar, and reach out to any one of our many MBH attorneys or managers if you have any questions at all. So keep working hard, you guys. We love working with you, and we're here if you need anything from us. Thank you, everybody. I'm seeing all of your thank yous pop into the chat. Thank you so much for coming. And we'll get back to you on any questions that we see that popped up throughout.